Welcome to Creative in Tech, a podcast show powered by ReadSpeaker AI. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and I'm the brand evangelist for North America at ReadSpeaker. And this show is all about highlighting the various brands, organizations, and people that are creatively using one of the fastest growing spaces in technology, artificial intelligence, including things like conversational AI, voice technology, and more. And today we're talking about AI in healthcare. And joining me for today's discussion is John Keehler. He is the Chief Strategy Officer at Runner Agency. Welcome, John. Excited to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
So you and I were talking offline before we started. You have a very interesting background, although I feel like it's familiar in this space. You started studying art and then kind of worked your way into marketing, and now you're doing marketing for the healthcare space. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into this and what excites you about the marketing space as a whole?
Yeah, so I began my career as a creative. So I went to art school, fine arts. I always thought that I would be a professor and teach art. That was kind of the path that I was on. But around the time that I graduated was when the first dot-com boom happened. And I got very interested in technology. Technology had always been kind of a part of my life growing up. We had a personal computer and, just really interested in technology. I used a lot in art school. So I immediately went from school into startup world. And again, initially as a creative. So I was a designer, although working at startups, I always say it was one of the smartest things I did in my whole career was to work in startups at the very beginning because I got a chance to wear a lot of hats. So I was a designer, but I was also doing things like I worked for an early streaming radio company, and I was like negotiating licensing contracts for music, right? With the RIAA and people like that. I had no business doing any of that, but because I was at a startup, I got a lot of opportunities. And it just gave me a very broad sense of the space. So my journey was sort of from creative into strategy. So I began as a pure creative designer. Then I moved into sort of more of a user experience design role. And then from that into more of a pure strategy role. So I spent a good amount of my career working in kind of big agency land, and was really fortunate to work on some amazing brands doing marketing strategy, digital marketing strategy, for brands like Chick-fil-A and Chrysler and the Home Depot and Walmart and all these really, really big brands with pretty significant and large budgets. All that to say, about 3 years ago, I ended up joining Runner Agency as a partner. And part of the reason that I joined Runner was I was getting kind of increasingly bored working on big brands, because the challenges of big brands it is a little bit different, right? Much more concerned about things like brand awareness and brand creative. And the work that Runner was doing really interested in me because it was much more data-driven and lead gen focused. And as someone whose kind of job it was to keep up on trends in the space and where everything was moving in digital marketing, I could see that things were, fastly becoming much more data-driven. And so that's where I wanted to be. So yeah, that's kind of my journey to where we're at right now. And again, Runner, a lot of the work that we do, obviously we're focused inside of healthcare. We work on medical practice and B2B work, but very different challenge, right? Than the kinds of challenges some of those big brands have.
Well, and it's good because you have that mix of a background. You have the creative side, you have the analytical side, you have from the big companies to some of maybe the mid-size or smaller companies, and now you've got different verticals as well. And we are talking about healthcare, and I always think of healthcare is so large. Sometimes we just think like hospitals or doctors or nurses, but you guys focus on a particular area of healthcare. Can you talk about what that is, maybe kind of some examples of the types of businesses and why you chose to focus on that area?
Yeah, it's still pretty broad. So I'll first talk about why I chose to focus on that area. So healthcare is kind of one of the last big industries to be disrupted by digital. And we're all living through that disruption right now, right? The last year is a great example of the changes in healthcare. We've basically leapfrogged forward, 8 to 10 years in terms of technology with things like telehealth, that we were headed that direction anyway, but everything got accelerated. So healthcare, I think part of the reason why I think healthcare is really interesting is it has some very unique challenges that other industries don't have, with things like HIPAA and things like targeting, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think that's a big place where AI plays a big role in healthcare. But also just because, genuinely, when you work in healthcare, you're really getting the opportunity to directly impact people's lives in a really good way, right? Everything we do in healthcare, right? We're helping someone feel better, get treatment, get things solved, live a better life. It's really gratifying, I think, to work on those kinds of challenges. So inside of healthcare, we work on a pretty broad range of healthcare, so both medical practices and B2B. But every different kind of vertical inside of healthcare, inside of medical, have very different challenges and limitations, right? Whether it's in terms of how they get patients, right? Do they primarily get patients referred from hospitals? Do they go after patients on their own? Are they cash pay? Are they insurance driven, right? There are a lot of different variables. The way that I typically talk about our focus in healthcare on the medical side, it's on medical practices that have a higher revenue per patient. So people that can actually afford to spend on marketing and should be spending more on marketing. And then B2B, again, is very diverse, right? Everything from people that are selling into CIOs at hospital systems to people that are selling into, insurance companies or selling directly to physicians, right? So there's a lot of variety, much more variety than I expected when I initially kind of started working in the space.
So some of the businesses that you all do, would you say that's like chiropractic places, fertility clinics? Like, is that kind of some of the areas that you're talking about that maybe aren't the B2B side?
Yeah, so it'd be a range of things, right? So typically everything from, spine and orthopedics to fertility, obviously, is a big space. Addiction treatment. There are all kinds of verticals on that side. I would say that the one sort of piece that we don't work with too much are much lower revenue per patient kinds of practices, like chiro or like general kind of family care, primary care physicians, those kinds of things. So we're working with more of the specialists, right?
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I said, healthcare is such a large space that sometimes we forget that there's kind of these verticals within healthcare. And as you mentioned earlier, in some ways, healthcare is always kind of the last, healthcare and government can tend to be the ones that are the last to catch up. But we saw them really push forward because of COVID, and that they had to. And so you started having all these advances. Can you talk a little bit about what you have seen now, especially in this last year, where you kind of see it going in terms of where AI and conversational AI fits into this healthcare space?
Yeah, so I think there are a few places, and I made some notes that I'll kind of talk through really quickly. There are a few specific areas where I see AI having the biggest impact in terms of healthcare, and so I want to talk through each of these, and then conversational marketing, I think, is one of the ones that I want to focus on a little bit. So, one of the places I think that's having the biggest impact in terms of AI is just in terms of targeting. So, ad targeting. It's probably the most common way that all marketers use AI, truly, is through ad targeting. So, anytime you run a lookalike ad on Facebook using their lookalike algorithm, that's using AI, right? And it's about just finding new people to show your ad and leveraging the power of AI to do that, right? An algorithm, artificial intelligence, can look at way more factors, individual factors at once than a human being could to determine that target. So this is particularly important in healthcare because of things like HIPAA, right? The HIPAA privacy requirements mean that oftentimes we can't use all of the data that we want to target people, or that data isn't collected, right? Because it's private data. So most of the most sophisticated healthcare advertising targeting, the kind of things that like pharma companies use, right, is basically lookalike targeting. It's basically targeting how likely is someone to have this condition based on all these other things we know about them, right? So it's kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around and understand, but it's, again, I think the most common use of AI in marketing in general is with this kind of targeting. The second thing I think is really important is, and we're seeing this a little bit more in things like B2B, is using AI for prediction. And what I mean by that is, if you're, let's say, a B2B client and you're selling into CIOs of a hospital system, when you get someone to download that white paper or submit a lead for some piece of content, how likely is that person to actually get on a sales call or do a demo with you, right? AI is starting to be used more for that lead prediction, and that's different than the manual kind of lead scoring that people already do in B2B, right? Where you're giving a score based on certain characteristics. This is actually AI looking at, what does someone do on your site? Where are all the things they click on? How many times they visit? All kinds of things that may not be in a typical lead score. And AI is being used to both personalize the experience and predict. So I think that's one kind of bigger trend with AI.
Yeah, I think that I was just going to say, I think that's a good one too, because, you can get potential higher accuracy because it is learning, and then it's going to target the right people, which is what your potential client would want and what you would want as well.
Yeah. And it's also about helping you figure out, where you spend your time and energy.
Yes.
Right. For most organizations, you're usually strapped a little bit, right, in terms of how many salespeople do I have? How many calls can I make a day? How much time and energy should I put into this prospect or that prospect? And so using that prediction just kind of gives your team a little bit of an extra nudge in the right direction. It's funny. I always talk about AI as almost every use case of AI right now. We're not giving control up completely to AI, right? We're using it as a tool to just help us make better decisions or do something faster or, whatever that is. So I think that's an interesting kind of perspective on AI to take. Like, it's not like AI will replace some things, but right now it's just a really great tool, especially when it comes to creative things like marketing, where there's still a very human element, to making a decision, and AI doesn't always get it right too, right? Sometimes it gets it wrong. The third trend, which I'm really excited about, which we use, we're starting to use more in the agency, is the idea of generative AI. So this is the idea that AI can do things like create copy. So we actively are using tools right now. And again, it's a tool that a copywriter kind of uses. It doesn't just automatically generate copy for you that you can copy and paste, but it helps you generate things like headlines or outlines for articles or things like that, that maybe something that used to take you 5 hours to do now only takes you 2 hours to do, right? That kind of generative AI is a really interesting space, and it is much better than you might believe right now for copy in particular. There have been some recent advances within the last year or two that have just made it so much better. And there's a bunch of these kind of tools on the market. But eventually, AI also doing things like generating video or images or things like that. There's a little bit of experimentation already happening in that area. But that generative AI piece, I think, is something that I get really excited about.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's again, it's replacing, I feel like, some of the amount of time that it takes to do the stuff we don't like, but it doesn't necessarily mean it takes away from the creative piece. And
Yeah.
I think that's something to kind of note as a whole. There's still the human creativity. This is just, as you said, a tool to kind of help you be able to do things faster, better, so you can really kind of push the creativity more, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you just think about it as it's kind of like the ultimate way to break through writer's block,
Hmm.
or to help you explore all the options you have. And again, it's something where AI can do something we can't do, or can do it faster than we can do. So the example with some of those generative copy tools is they'll do things like look at the articles that are the top of search results for something that you're trying to write a piece of content around, right? And so it's pulling inspiration from lots of places much more quickly than you could if you were going to do it manually.
Yes. No, I think
Yeah.
that's good. Are you seeing anything either with your agency or in the healthcare space in terms of conversational AI, meaning whether it's like using a voice technology with an Amazon Alexa or Google Assistant, or a chatbot, or anything that's kind of integrating either of those things that's more conversational within, like I said, your agency or with any of your clients?
Yeah, so that's kind of the fourth thing that I had. So I think one thing that's really interesting to think about is conversational marketing is kind of this broad category definition. There are lots of things that fall inside of it, right? So there's live chat, there's chatbots, there's messenger marketing, which is very different, right? And
Mhm.
and then in addition to that, there's also text messaging. So one thing that I will say is like I feel like conversational marketing is definitely important in terms of healthcare. Um, I would say the way that we're using it and the way that most clients in healthcare are using it are site chatbots or live chat. That's sort of the predominant use inside of healthcare. Um, the way that I think about conversational marketing is that the primary problem you're solving is waiting, right? In a traditional live chat scenario, or if you call, there's always a question mark about how long am I going to have to wait for this to happen. But with things like chatbots and texting and messenger marketing, there's much more immediate feedback. So I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were saying, well, why would somebody use a chatbot? Like, why would they use a chatbot? Or I think someone was kind of just commenting, there's so many sites now that have this little chatbot widgets on it. What rationale do I have to engage with that at all? And my response to that is, you don't have to wait. That's why people are engaging with it. If it's live chat, maybe you go in a queue and you don't know how long you're going to sit there, right? That's what Amazon does. If I need to talk to Amazon, right? If I call somebody, and one thing that we see a lot in healthcare is a lot of calls don't get answered, right? Something like a third of all calls. When you call medical practice, right, it doesn't get answered. It goes to voicemail. You might call another practice if that happens. So there's an immediacy, I think, to that chat experience. The other thing is that you can have, at least with chatbots, you can actually have an anonymous conversation, which I think is pretty interesting. And is very relevant for things like healthcare, right? When it may feel like something that's a little too sensitive for you to call and talk to some front desk person at an office about. If you're just in the research phase and you're trying to get some questions answered, a chatbot can be a great way to do that, right? One of the macro trends I think that we're seeing across all of our clients, and part of the reason why we're developing triggered text messaging sequences, is there is a overwhelming desire inside of healthcare right now for patients to have communication via text. They don't want to talk as much over email. They may be hesitant to call or find a time during the day that's convenient for them to call. That's a big thing we deal with in healthcare a lot, right? Is I can even ask someone to call me on the site, but if they call at 2:00 when I'm putting my kid down for a nap, right, I'm not going to answer, and they may never get a hold of me again. But if I text them, then they can text me back quickly. They can let me know when it's convenient, all these sorts of things. And that's not just for patients too. I will say, like, physicians are also much easier to contact via text message, right? Because they're busy, like everybody else, they're busy. So
yeah, there's I don't know if you've heard of it because it's a female app, but it's an app called Flow, FLO. Have you heard of that?
I have it.
Okay. So I think it's an app, and it's probably, in my opinion, one of the best conversational chatbots I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And the whole point of it is for women's menstrual health.
Yeah.
And it's been, there's a bunch of doctors that they work with, but it's all chat. So you can ask questions, or it will talk about the cycle, and it just goes through, and it's incredible. And then it will say, of course, we're, always talk with your doctor, that kind of caveat there, but it'll give you certain content that may be helpful. Here you can show your doctor all your data and all the information or questions that you have. And it's so impressive. And that's something that would be good for something like you said, a chatbot, because it's a little bit more private. That's not something maybe you want to be talking fully to someone about, or you only see your doctor maybe once a year for something like that. And it's really impressive how that app has been able to use that in healthcare, and just the amount of women that you can do private chats. You can also be in these anonymous group chats and have discussions. And it's just a really interesting use case that I have found from a conversational point. And I'm talking to a bot. I'm not talking to a human being. And it gives me what I need. Again, obviously, if there was a bigger question, I would go to the doctor and that sort of thing. But it kind of helps facilitate those in between, those waiting times, even during the year, as you mentioned. Can you share maybe some use cases? I don't know if you can share, who they are, but companies that you've worked with that have seen some results from maybe some of this conversational pieces that you're talking about, or some of the other AI.
Yeah, so I'll share two examples, and not getting into specific clients, but I'll share two examples. So the most common example, right, that we see with any client is adding a chatbot to the site. And that always drives incremental leads, right? So you're driving net new leads that you would not have driven if you hadn't had that added to the site. In my experience, it's not a gigantic, right, like influx of people, but that just basic functionality it will drive more new patient leads, 100%. And I think that's what that's becoming, is just kind of a foundational thing that everybody has to do. The second example I'll share with you is something that I think is a little bit more interesting and not as common. So I think that there is a fundamental issue, not just inside of healthcare marketing, but just with marketing in general, of people not really thinking about what the right call to action is, or what the right kind of lead type is. So we all just kind of go into default lead mode for whatever reason, right? It's call me or submit some sort of a contact form, right? Or if you're a SaaS company or something, you probably just do schedule a demo, or right? There's these weird kind of category conventions that get created, and people just don't break them. And I think we should. I think we should be thinking a little bit more about them. So one of the things that that runners started doing a number of years ago, that's been effective for our clients, and we're certainly now not the only folks doing this, but I think it's really important, is rethinking those lead types. So when we work with a spine and orthopedics practice, as an example, instead of just saying, contact us or give us a call, those are both important, but we also have pain assessments, right? That are basically survey-like lead forms where we get people starting to talk about where's the pain that you're experiencing, how long have you experienced it, all those kinds of things that help us better understand if they're a fit for the treatments, right, that we might offer. But it also helps the patient feel like they're starting to get some answers to their problem. So one of the great use cases is just to treat that form like a conversation, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think, and again, this isn't just for healthcare marketing, but I think it's particularly important for healthcare marketing. Education is the best marketing you can do as a healthcare provider, right? Helping people make more educated decisions, helping make sure that patients are more educated before they reach out is really key. What is this treatment you offer? You know, all those kinds of things. You can answer a lot of those questions. So the people that you do get on the phone or you do have a conversation with at some point with a real person, they're more educated. They're usually more ready to book an office visit or something like that. So that's kind of like, that's something we preach a lot about rethinking those lead types and not just falling into the default mode of, hey, this is what everybody else does, so we should do that too.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's also much more engaging. It creates a better customer experience because, yeah, if you go and you're like, okay, I can't get a hold of anybody and this thing is just telling me to call them, but I already did, there's a frustration there. And so if you have something that feels like they've been helped, then maybe they're okay and willing to wait, you know, a day or two to get a phone call back. So that makes sense. You had written an article in Forbes a little while ago, kind of talking about comparing healthcare a little bit with kind of the retailer e-commerce space.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned about this idea of also talking about brand and thinking similar to how retail does. Can you speak to what you meant by that in terms of that article and how healthcare can do that?
Yeah. So there's, again, healthcare is going through this really interesting disruption. And one of the disruptions is there is a lot more direct to consumer healthcare retail happening. So think things like supplements, right? That people are seeking out, even things like self-diagnostic testing or other kinds of brands where you may have an experience with a retailer where there's a physician reviewing an application, but you never actually see anybody. Right. There's a big change happening on that direct to consumer healthcare retail side of things. And the one thing that group of brands is doing is truly building a recognizable brand. So I think that's something that, you know, when you can build up a brand, build some brand recognition, articulate things like why you're different or better, articulate, you know, who your ideal patient is, the more you can clarify that brand, the easier it is to do all the rest of the marketing, right? And I think there in healthcare in particular, there are some very common mistakes, right, that I see a lot of physicians, medical practices making, right, which is talking only about themselves and their credentials, not talking about the patient and their problems, not a lot of articulation between why one physician is different than another physician. You know, reviews are obviously a big part of that, but it's a very common thing that we see. Like everybody, all these marketers say the exact same things, right? We care about our patients. We're very patient centric, right? So you have to find another way to kind of bring that to life. And so one of the things I think is really cool about a lot of the direct consumer healthcare brands is they're bringing that stuff to life in the design, in the patient experience, being something different that you might not have seen before, right? All those kinds of things. So again, the thing that gets me the most excited about the industry is that we're just on, I think, the cusp of a lot of this change and innovation. And every other innovation I've seen, like back in the day. So I actually worked on the very first commercial blog that was ever released in like 2001, 2000. It was really early in the world of blogging. Terrible backlash, by the way, to the brand. But nobody would think twice about it today. All the innovation I've seen in the last, 20 years I've been doing this, we could see these things coming down the line. It was just a matter of how quickly they happened.
Yeah.
And that's what I see inside of healthcare right now. Like it's there, it's happening, it's going to accelerate. So that's what I get really excited about.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, when we talk about chatbots, I had used chatbots myself, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's interesting now to see it becoming a bigger thing, because part of me is like, oh, it's been around forever. But now people are starting to kind of get into it. And when we look at, voice bots or voice technology, same thing. It's been around for a while, but you're slowly starting to see people get into it, start to use it more. In terms of branding as a whole, we see a lot of people use certain colors, certain logos. Where do you think things like having either like a sonic brand where there's music or sound, as well as like a specific voice, whether that's a voice artist or like a text to speech custom voice like we do here at ReadSpeaker, where do you see those things kind of fitting in now or into the future in terms of healthcare and some of the marketing that you're speaking of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a holistic way of presenting your brand that I don't think a lot of people think about, right? Every touch point that you have with a customer or a potential customer is an opportunity to reinforce that branding. And so in my big agency life, right, that meant every little touch point was always considered, right? Everything from the voice and the voicemail to the tone of the copy in email, the tone of a text message going out, right? Everything. And so I think we're at a really interesting place right now where I think smaller marketers are starting to realize the importance of brand as well, right? And especially when you get into things like direct consumer healthcare where it's super competitive. Or I talk a lot now about anybody starting a telehealth business right now. It's one of the most competitive spaces, right? Because now you're not only competing against the Teladocs of the world, the behemoths, right? You're competing against any doctor in any other state that wants to spin up a telehealth practice. So it's super crowded. So brand, we often talk about, right, is brand is the most defensible moat you can build around your business. It's the thing that people can't copy. And so thinking about the way that I would like to think about it is think about every touch point you have with a potential patient, and what kind of experience they're having. And there should be a consistency. So I've always talked about, like, there are 3 things that every really great brand has in common, right? One of those things is conviction. So everybody inside of the organization understands what the brand is about, right? The second thing is consistency, right? So the brand is consistent at every touch point. You don't have, one weird touch point where it's completely off brand and doesn't make sense at all. And then the third thing is some sort of a connection, right? Some sort of an emotional connection, which I think is extremely important. And you and I had talked about this before the podcast, but I'm a big believer that empathy is one of the most important ingredients you can add into your marketing. And really, like, what better way to do that than through some sort of conversation or interaction, right? Um, I think video is one of the best, obviously, empathy ways to add empathy because you can see and hear and all that kind of stuff. Um, but that's kind of what voice does that text doesn't do. And it's something that having a conversation does better than just a big, paragraph of copy, right?
Yeah. I think that I 100% agree. I think, like you said, we were talking offline before. We're both artists. You're more of a fine artist, a performing artist for myself in our backgrounds. And that ability for creatives to understand empathy and connection and to really be pushing that into this technology space. That's part of the reason, the show is called Creative in Tech. We are seeing so much more blend of that nowadays, the value of that, to have that piece. So I appreciate you bringing that to light here.
Yeah.
If somebody is in the healthcare space and they're like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm staying innovative. I want to make sure that I'm being seen, but also creating a great customer experience across the board. Do you have maybe one tip of advice for them that you would give?
Yeah, I think the empathy piece is the ultimate advice that I would give them. Um, and and what that means, I think, is really understanding who your potential patient is and what their problems are and what they're feeling, right? And addressing those things. Um, we work with a lot of medical practices, but also B2B organizations that once they start reframing all of their marketing in terms of answering customer problems and identifying with how customers feel those pain points, it completely changes everything they do, right? The example I gave before with medical marketers just talking about themselves and their credentials, when you put yourself in the feet of your patients and you change your marketing to address their problems, then you don't talk about that stuff. Or you talk about it, but it's a little piece of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
You talk more about how you're going to make them feel better and how they solve this problem they have. So it sounds like a very simple thing, but it's a heavier lift, right, than you might imagine.
Yes.
And I think it's a heavier lift because a lot of people aren't really in touch with what their customers want and need. And it takes a little bit of time of really empathizing with them. There's a quote, isn't it? I think Brene Brown talks about empathy a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the biggest mistakes she says that people make is empathy isn't just feeling for someone, right? It's not sympathy. It's feeling it with them. And that's very different, right? You're not you're not trying to, oh, we feel so bad for you. We know how you feel, right? This is how you feel. And that's why we do what we do. So I think empathy is the thing. Empathy is the easiest thing to add that will really differentiate you.
Yes.
Even if you can't differentiate on the service you offer or whatever, you can differentiate with empathy for sure.
I 100% agree. I love that. Love Brene Brown as well. So love that you slid that in there too. If people want to connect with you, if they want to learn about anything else that we spoke about today, where is the best place to do that?
Best place is to visit runneragency.com. That's our site. And obviously for me individually, John Keehler, you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Perfect. Well, I thank you so much, John, for being here and sharing your thoughts on brand, on marketing, and AI in the healthcare space. We greatly appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our ReadSpeaker AI YouTube channel, as well as our audio podcast show, Creative in Tech, wherever you listen to podcasts.